More than 620,000 soldiers lost their lives. Thousands more bore brutal scars. Families, north and south, grieved the loss of husbands, brothers, sons, and fathers. In the South, the war brought dislocation and displacement to tens of thousands, white and black, creating a massive refugee crisis and leaving thousands homeless. The Southern economy was in upheaval. By contrast, the war set off massive economic expansion in the North. Northern victory preserved the Union, and it strengthened the very notion of the United States of America. The national government became vastly more powerful. 4 million slaves were freed. Ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery throughout the nation. Of the results of the U.S. Civil War, none was more transformative than this new birth of freedom. Former slaves emerged from bondage with distinct ideas about the meaning of freedom, self-reliance, family stability, religious liberty, economic opportunity, and political participation. Their activism, local, state, and national, helped forge profound change in the national concept of civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 defined all persons born in the United States as citizens and spelled out certain rights that could not be denied. In 1868, ratification of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution promised equal protection under the law, regardless of race, a promise to be enforced by the federal government if violated by the states. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prevented states from denying the right to vote because of race. Though these laws and amendments would stand, their immediate benefit for blacks would be gradually reversed in the following decades. The years following the Civil War were a time of profound social revolution in the United States. After a brief period, Congress implemented a sweeping plan for Reconstruction in the South, defining the process for bringing former Confederate states back into the Union and granting civil and political rights to blacks. Leaders from within black communities emerged as eloquent spokesmen and effective activists. Blacks, and whites who had little authority before the war, voted in large numbers and elected Republicans to lead their state and local governments. For the first time, black candidates won positions at every level of government. The first working biracial democracy in the history of the country took hold in the South. The states took an expansive approach to rebuilding, focusing on economic recovery and creating the region's first free public education systems, new hospitals, and relief for the poor. In a region where education had been available to few, over half the children were now in school. But the South's old leadership, planters, merchants, and Democratic politicians, fought to retain as much as possible of the old economy and social order. Many Northern investors supported these efforts, hoping the plantation system could be revitalized with blacks as laborers. Former slave owners argued that Republicans had no right to force black equality on the South. The Ku Klux Klan, founded shortly after the war, increasingly intimidated and terrorized blacks and members of new local and state governments. White Northerners grew weary of the federal government's Reconstruction efforts in the South. In both regions, false depictions of the incompetence of blacks fueled opposition to Reconstruction. Violent threats and attacks increased, and the old leadership regained control of local and state governments across the South. In 1877, when President Rutherford B. Hayes promised to end federal intervention in the South, the last of the Southern states returned to Democratic control and Reconstruction ended. Over the next 20 years, state and city lawmakers across the country enacted laws that denied blacks basic civil rights in virtually every sector of commercial and public life. In the South, this became a comprehensive legal system known by the name Jim Crow. In 1896, the United States Supreme Court made segregation the law of the land through the landmark Plessy v. Ferguson case. The court's ruling gave states the right to maintain so-called separate but equal facilities for education, transportation, and public accommodations. Indeed, most facilities were separate, but rarely equal. By the turn of the century, the political and economic interests of many white Southerners and Northerners began to align. They were ready to reconcile. They de-emphasized issues that brought on war, issues like the crisis over slavery. Instead, they began to recall the war as a great national tragedy that forged even greater national unity, to be mutually commemorated by both the blue and gray on battlefields and in cemeteries across the country. In 1913, at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, Union and Confederate veterans posed for a photograph, clasping hands across a stone wall their armies had fought over long ago. This image came to symbolize national reconciliation. But in truth, the image depicts a reconciliation for whites only. Of the 50,000 spectators and veterans at Gettysburg, the few black participants were there not as celebrants, but as laborers to build the massive tent city, serve meals, distribute blankets, and clean the latrines. President Woodrow Wilson addressed the gathering. He made no mention of slavery or the new birth of freedom that President Lincoln had called for in his Gettysburg address. Instead, he congratulated Americans for making peace, calling the war a quarrel forgotten, and returned to Washington to continue his aggressive program of racial segregation of federal agencies. In 1913, nearly 50 years after the war, blacks found themselves still struggling to affirm one of the principal gains of the war, the right of citizenship. Days are breaking my soul. The Civil War restored and redefined the United States. It brought freedom to 4 million enslaved blacks, and it launched a debate over the definition of liberty for its citizens, a debate that produced constitutional amendments that would be the legal foundation for profound changes in American culture and society. Though the struggle for equality for all citizens would continue, the laws had been written, the seeds planted. A new birth of freedom would not be stilled.